Chapter 13. Things Must Improve. We drove into town. Mrs. Chen had her own car. Even Uncle didn't have a car. The lift took us right down underneath the apartment block into a huge parking area where Mrs. Chen opened the doors to a big silver saloon and told me to get in the back. As we drove out into the street, I was astonished to see how many cars there were driving up and down. Not just taxis, but cars with ordinary people in them. We travelled along a wide road where apartment blocks towered above us, all of them new and brilliantly lit. Glossy fronted shops were filled with slender mannequins sporting the most extravagant fashions. Did people really wear such clothes, I wondered? I became aware that Mrs. Chen was observing me again, glancing in her mirror. The smile appeared when she saw that I had noticed her. "Try not to gawp, Lucienne. It's not very becoming. We don't want you to look like an ignorant peasant girl, do we?" She drew up outside a row of smaller shops, the second of which advertised itself as a hairdresser's and beauty salon. The owner came to the shop door the minute she saw Mrs. Chen, held it open for her and greeted her respectfully. "The child needs her hair tamed, cut in a short bob, I think, with a straight fringe out of her eyes. You will also need to work on her hands. They're ingrained with dirt. Heaven knows what she's been using them for." "Yes, Mrs. Chen. Certainly, Mrs. Chen." Mrs. Chen gave her orders and sat down with a magazine, while an assistant brought her tea. I watched tearfully in the mirror, my thick black hair falling to the ground in large clumps, a neat, well-behaved bob appearing in its place. My hands were scoured and oiled, my nails carefully clipped into immaculate crescent moons. The manager sought Mrs. Chen's approval, who declared the result a great improvement, and I was whisked off for the next stage in my transformation. I was quite excited by the prospect of new clothes that fitted, beautiful clothes like those I could see on some of the girls who passed us, girls I couldn't help turning to admire, even though I could see Mrs. Chen's lips tightening. Perhaps I might look as pretty as they did. We stopped at a small clothes shop. Once again, the manager rushed to open the door for us and to serve Mrs. Chen. "I want something in the way of a uniform for this child," she said. "You know the sort of thing. A servant's uniform, calf length, perhaps in black or navy with a white collar." "Certainly, madam. What about this?" The manager pulled from a rail a plain navy dress, very straight, a small pleat at the back of the skirt, long-sleeved, buttoned at the wrists with a white collar. "Try it on, Lucienne." When I emerged from the changing room, Mrs. Chen clapped her hands. "Perfect," she smiled. "We'll have two, plus 2 plain white blouses, one of those navy coats over there, plus 2 pairs of socks, underwear and pyjamas. Nothing too fancy." Purchases in hand, I was then taken to a shoe shop where Mrs. Chen chose a pair of heavy black lace-ups. "Good and sturdy," she said. "Nothing frivolous. We wouldn't want to damage your young feet, would we?" On the way back to the car, she told me what a lucky girl I was, to have so much money spent on me, and that as soon as we were home, I was to change into my new clothes and throw my old ones away. It was nearly midday by the time we returned to the apartment. I had 5 minutes in which to change, then I was to go to the study to receive instructions about my duties. I stared in the mirror and didn't recognise the person standing there. She looked older, thinner, more serious than the girl I remembered. There was a shadowy air of resignation about her as well, which I instantly fought by hiding my favourite old blouse behind the chest of drawers. Mrs. Chen wasn't going to have all of me. I left my room reluctantly and went in search of the study. Passing one of the doors in the hall, I was sure I heard voices. I stopped to listen. All was silent. Should I go in? There was the sound of a pan clattering in the kitchen. I continued in that direction, heard a door open behind me, and turned to see Mrs. Chen emerging from the room I had just hesitated by. "Where are you going, child?" she said irritably. "Can't you obey a simple instruction? I said the study." "I don't know which is the study." The smile appeared. "Of course. How silly of me. It's this room here." She showed me in and sat me down on a wooden chair facing a wall covered with shelf upon shelf of pristine spined books, while she stood at the window, her back to me. "You will rise at 6 o'clock, she said. "Lateness will not be tolerated. Cook will leave you a list in the kitchen of foodstuffs to prepare for breakfast. You will do as he asks, then you will lay the table in the dining room, 4 settings. You will eat alone in the kitchen when we have finished. You will find everything you need in the large cupboard. At 6:45 promptly, you will return to your room to clean yourself up and make your bed. I will not expect to see you again until you come for your breakfast at 7:30. After you have eaten, you will clear up, having learned from your errors this morning." She smiled before continuing with a list that included washing, ironing, cleaning, as well as preparing and clearing up after meals. I struggled hard to take it all in. It seemed I wasn't to be free each day until 8 o'clock in the evening, when I was to retire to my room. "Can you sew?" asked Mrs. Chen. I nodded. I had often sewn patches in Lihu's trousers and darned my own clothes. "Good. After lunch, you can make a start by replacing the buttons on these shirts. But first I shall introduce you to Cook, and you can help to prepare our lunch." I followed her out of the study and along to the kitchen. There, to my astonishment, she took hold of the arm of the young man standing by the stove and swung him round to face me. Her whole manner was suddenly smiling and flirtatious. "Xiangfei, this is Luciane, who has come to help you in the kitchen. Haven't you, Luciane? Show her how we do things here, won't you, Xiangfei? I'd be so grateful to you." She patted him possessively on the shoulder. Xiangfei smiled. "Yes, Mrs. Chen. Of course, Mrs. Chen. I'll leave it to you then. Call me if there are any problems." She patted him again on the shoulder, then sailed gracefully past me out of the room, leaving a trail of her perfume to mingle familiarly with the aromas from Xiangfei's cooking. I stood there uncertainly, waiting for him to speak first, when I thought I heard him mutter "witch" under his breath. He looked at me steadily, winked, and said, "Don't look so terrified, Luciane. I won't bite." Then he whispered, "I leave that to other people. Now be careful what you say in here. The walls have ears." Unwittingly, I glanced round at the walls, causing Xiangfei to smile, a big, wide smile which lit up his eyes. He wasn't particularly good-looking, but his face was strong and full of mischief. I blushed shyly. "You're so young," he said. "Why aren't you at home with your parents?" And then suddenly businesslike, "Prepare these vegetables for me, would you, Luciane?" A shadow passed by the door, then we heard another door closing. "Be careful not to chop your fingers off, Luciane," Xiangfei smiled. "The knives are very sharp, and the sight of blood makes me faint clean away." I smiled back. I began chopping and shaping the vegetables, slowly at first because I didn't want to make any mistakes, then more confidently when Xiangfei started to whistle while he worked. "I bet you can't chop onions without crying, Luciane," he said. "They make me cry so much I could flood the Yangtze with my tears." I giggled self-consciously. "I'll try," I said. He passed the onions to me. "No tears then," he said. "I shall be watching." I cut the top off the first onion, peeled back the brown skin, then sliced down to the root. As I chopped it all into small pieces, tears welled up in my eyes, and one escaped down my cheek. "Oh, my poor Luciane," wailed Xiangfei dramatically. "Please don't cry. You will make my heart break. You failed the test, by the way. I will do the onions. You do the ginger." I had more fun preparing that meal than I had had for a very long time, though we were careful not to attract Mrs. Chen's attention. Xiangfei told me that he was an art student. He cooked for the Chens to pay his college fees, and had been with them for 6 months. He arrived, cooked, then left, 3 times a day, 7 days a week. "Have you met their son?" I couldn't help asking. "Never. I've only met Mr. Chen once, and that was when I applied for the job. Mornings and evenings I cook for 5 people, including the domestic, but I go before anyone sits down to eat. Lunchtimes I cook for 2 or 3. If nothing else, little silk swallow, you will eat well while I am here." "Have there been other servants?" "You have replaced an old housekeeper, Mrs. Wu, who had been with the Chens for 18 years. 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Chen told Mrs. Wu, without any warning, that her services were no longer required. That made me feel terrible. Do you know why she was sent away?" I asked. Before he could answer, Mrs. Chen strode into the kitchen, looked challengingly at Xiangfei, and asked me why the table hadn't been set. "You were rather slow today, Xiangfei," she said. "I hope you are not being distracted from your work." "Not at all, Mrs. Chen. Luciane and I are getting along very well," he replied, fixing her directly with his eyes. Mrs. Chen was clearly unsure how to take this, but after a moment's hesitation she smiled sweetly and said, "Good, I'm glad to hear it." She moved next to him, took him by the elbow and continued, "I would like to make it quite clear, though, that I will not tolerate gossip. Is that understood?" "Yes, Mrs. Chen," Xiangfei and I both nodded. "Then I shall expect lunch to be ready in 15 minutes' time." As soon as she had left the room, Xiangfei picked up a knife and made stabbing noises towards the door. "Grrr, I hate her," he growled through gritted teeth. "Pawing me like a pet dog. If I didn't need the money so much, I would tell her what I thought of her and her miserable job." He turned back to his cooking, muttering angrily to himself. I went into the dining room to set the table. How many for, I wondered? 2 or 3? If it was 3, who else was coming? Was I supposed to lay a place for myself, even though I would not be eating with them? Perhaps I should lay only one place for Mrs. Chen herself. I returned to the kitchen, where Xiangfei was putting on his coat, ready to leave. I don't know how many place settings to lay, I said, wishing so hard that he could stay. Always 2, unless Mrs. Chen is lunching out. But I'm to eat separately, she told me. The other place is for her mother-in-law. She lives here too. I haven't met her, I said. She's a lovely old lady, said Xiangfei, not at all like Mrs. Chen. See you this evening, Lucianne. Good luck. I went back into the dining room and laid the table for 2 people. What should I do next, though? I wondered. Was I supposed to bring in the food? Should I wait to make sure that everything was all right? Too late. There were voices outside. The door opened and a tiny, frail old lady in a wheelchair entered the room. Behind her was Mrs. Chen. What are you doing here? She snapped. I thought I told you that you were to eat separately. I didn't know if you wanted me to bring the food through. That should have been done already. I see I shall have to do it myself. Who is this pretty young child? Interrupted the old lady, in a voice as smooth as silk. Won't you introduce me, Chimay? The lips pursed, the eyes tightened. I could see that Mrs. Chen was livid, though she tried to hide it. Just our new domestic, mother. She has a lot to learn, I'm afraid. Ah, to replace old Mrs. Wu. So sad that she decided to leave us after so many years. Tell me, child, what is your name? Mrs. Chen jumped in before I could reply. Her name is Lucianne. Now, mother, if you don't mind, she has work to do. Can you read, Lucianne? The old lady persisted. Again, Mrs. Chen replied for me. She's a peasant girl. Of course she can't read. Why would she need to? I can read, Mrs. Chen. I couldn't help saying. I learned at school. Mrs. Chen turned on me. How dare you contradict me? She spat. Who do you think you are? I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen. I should like Lucianne to read to me. This was made as a statement by the old lady, not a request. Mrs. Chen looked as though she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She took a deep breath, grabbed hold of the handles of her mother-in-law's wheelchair, and pushed her roughly to her place at the table. Impossible, she declared. Her day is full already, and now, if you don't mind, I insist that she return to her work while we sit down to eat before our meal is cold. Lucianne, you may clear the table in half an hour. In the meantime, there is plenty of washing up for you to make a start on. She smiled sweetly at both of us, then husked me out of the room before her mother-in-law could respond. Alone in the kitchen, I tried not to repeat my errors of the morning. I was exhausted. My head was pounding. All I wanted was to go home, for this nightmare to end. I finished cleaning a saucepan, sat down at the table and put my head in my hands. This was to be my home. These people were my family. I rebelled against every notion of it. I wanted my mother. She would never willingly have let this happen. I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I knew, Mrs. Chen was slamming dishes down by the sink. 30 minutes, I said, Lucianne. 30 minutes, then clear the table. That was 45 minutes ago. Your lunch is cold. You'll have to go without. When you have finished washing these dishes, you will find the sewing waiting for you in the study. She smiled then. I'm sure things must improve. Please, Mrs. Chen, please, can I send a letter to my mother and tell her where I am? I begged. I don't think that's a good idea, Lucianne, she replied. Your mother doesn't want you. That's why you're here. I didn't stop for a moment for the rest of that first day. When Xiangfei arrived early that evening, he found me polishing silverware at the kitchen table. I was so relieved to see him that to my embarrassment I burst into tears. He closed the door and leant against it so that no one could come in, then called me over to him. I pressed my head against his chest and sobbed. What's the matter, little sparrow? He asked, stroking my hair. Swallow, not sparrow, I spluttered through my sobs. You look like a drab little sparrow at the moment, rather than a sleek and shiny swallow. Has the wicked witch been nasty to you? She won't let me write a letter to my mother. Then write it, and I shall send it for you, said Xiangfei. But you'll get into trouble. Only if I'm caught. A movement of the door handle made him grab my arm and pull me across the kitchen to the sink, where he turned on the tap and began to splash my face with water. What on earth are you doing? I swiveled my head to catch Mrs. Chen staring at us in absolute astonishment. Lucianne rubbed her eyes and got silver polish in them. I'm just trying to wash it out. Are you indeed? How very kind of you, Xiangfei. The voice purred. but the lips were pursed. "Now, perhaps you'd like to prepare our meal, which is what we pay you for." "Yes, Mrs. Chen." "As for you, Luciane, be a little more careful, will you, so as not to disrupt the rest of the staff?" "Yes, Mrs. Chen," I replied, water running down my face from my sodden hair. As soon as she was out of earshot, Xiangfei shook with stifled laughter. "Did you see her face, Luciane?" Then, more serious, he said, "Don't ever let her see you cry, little sparrow, for she'll know she's broken you then. Cry on my shoulder, or alone in your room, but never in front of her." I nodded and thanked him for this kindness. We worked in silence for a time. I could hear men's voices drifting along the hall from distant rooms. Was I about to meet the boy I'd been told I was to marry, Yimu? I wanted to ask Xiangfei to take me away with him when he left, so that I would never have to meet this Yimu. I crept into the dining room to set the table, then crept out again as quickly as I could, back to the safety of the kitchen. "Tell me to mind my own business if you like," said Xiangfei, looking at me quizzically. "But how old are you?" 11, I replied quietly. "And are they paying you to work here?" I glanced towards the door, praying that Mrs. Chen wasn't listening in on us, for I was sure that this constituted more than just gossip, and that we would suffer the consequences. I bit my lip and shook my head. How could I explain that Mr. Chen owned me, that he had bought me from my uncle, that I was his to do what he liked with, that this was my family now? "It's disgraceful," exploded Xiangfei. "If they don't pay you, they're treating you like a slave. I shall tell them so. I shall put a stop to it." I shook my head vehemently. "No, Xiangfei, no. There's nothing you can do. It's not like that." In my heart, I felt it was worse than that. Far worse to be bought, shaped and moulded as the perfect, obedient future daughter-in-law than simply to work for no pay. Was that what Mrs. Chen was doing? "Then what is it like?" asked Xiangfei gently. "Why aren't you at home with your mother?" "She didn't want me to go. I know she didn't want me to go, but she couldn't afford to keep me. Not on her own. Not once Li Hu was born, and father died, and she was ill, and there was the drought, and uncle said it was the only way for mother and Li Hu to survive." I could feel myself becoming tearful again. "Don't let Mrs. Chen see you cry," I said to myself. "Mr. Chen bought me from my uncle. When I'm old enough, I'm to marry their son. It's been agreed." Xiangfei stared at me in total disbelief. "But you're just a baby," he said. Then, as we heard footsteps, "Write that letter, Luciane. I'll post it to your mother if it's the last thing I do."